Hey everybody, I'm back to give you a little bit more on making an LS engine swap. Our car for the swap is a Cadillac. It's an 87 Cadillac Brougham rear-wheel drive and has an Oldsmobile 307 and a 204R transmission in it. So those have to come out before we can prep to put the new engine in. On one hand, that seems like it should be real simple and like falling off a log. But kind of the point of this video is that there are some things that we had to think about as we went through. And so I'm going to just share how I did it, what I thought about, how I advised my son to work on it. And he did a bunch of the prep and I went and helped him with some of it. And we worked our way through it and got the engine and transmission out. The Cadillac has a relatively it's a kind of a busy engine compartment, but it does have a fair amount of room to work. But there are a lot of connections in here. And what I'll say is that this process will be very similar if you had a Olds 88 or a Buick LeSabre of about that rear-wheel drive of that vintage, or a Cutlass, or one of the Pontiac Grand Prix, kind of the B car, G car, A-body, formerly A-body cars that GM made that are body on frame. You would probably find that there are a lot of similarities between that and what we're working on. One thing I would note on the Cadillac is, everybody says, hey, the GM cars, we're all the same between divisions. But I'll tell you, as you go in here, you'll find that on the Cadillacs, there's a lot more hardware than I had a Buick LeSabre. It was an 85, and it was a nice car. I'm not complaining about it. But the Cadillac is a step above because they add extra braces, they add extra rubber grommets and isolating bushings and things. And so as you're taking things apart, there typically are some additional things that the Cadillac folks use to create a quieter car that they will pay extra for, because you're paying extra for a Cadillac. But otherwise, beyond that, this car is very similar to my 85 Buick. So we're going to kind of click through this, and I already showed you a video in my intro of actually us physically pulling the engine on video. This is more like, how do you get ready to pull the engine? What's the prep that you do to get yourself started? One of the things that my son did a really good job of is you really want to take a lot of pictures. You can do some of it with video, but a lot of stills, and those you're going to see this afternoon. You aren't just going to take out the engine and transmission, you're going to put in a new engine and transmission that are different. And so documenting where all the plumbing went, where all the wires went, will help you when it's time to put the new engine in and you're trying to sort things out. This process is going to take us months, and this is another one where keeping track of all the parts and keeping track of all the wires is going to be a big deal, or you'll pay for it later. So taking the time early to document is a good thing. So here he's kind of picking up the cooling system and the air conditioning tubing and so forth, and just where does everything route. One interesting thing on this radiator is that it's got this capped off fitting up here, which I think when we get the LS engine in we're going to find a good use for. It's nice that it has this because it'll make our life easier later, because the LS has some return lines that need a place to go. More on that, like I say, more on that later. You need to start pulling all the trim. Now, I'm going to say is, when I did my Camaro, and you can go back and look at my Camaro videos that I have posted, I elected not to disassemble the front end of the car. I only needed to pull the engine, I didn't pull the transmission, and some folks have said, hey, you could pull both. Could. But everything that I suspected on that car was that the transmission was fine, and I spent the time to do bell housing bolts and disconnect things at the back of the engine and get underneath and disconnect the transmission and the bell housing or the torque converter bolts. and push the torque converter back, and then just lift the engine. If I had done engine and transmission, I would have probably needed to pull more out of the front of the car. Now on this project with the LS, not only are we taking out the engine and bringing in a new one, when you bring in the new one, you bring in a new mounting system, you bring in a lot of new hardware. So it seemed appropriate to clear out and remove everything from the front of the car out so that you have access to get in, to make the measurements that you need, and to get things lined up that are a whole lot harder if you're trying to come, top down into the engine compartment. So start out by, disconnecting headlights and parking lights, and you'll see my signature blue tape in there marking which sockets went where. Down underneath, documenting how some of these braces connected and the back of the bumper and how everything lined up. And here you can see this is kind of the Cadillac typical rubber grommets that they used. Help take out some of the vibration in the structure. And here you'll see another one, and lots of penetrating oil to get some of these bolts loose. And then, as you can see, this is just progress, right? We got all the headlights disconnected, he's got the bumper off. Paying attention, here's another one where there was a wire from the headlights, a ground wire. So he's captured the bolt, he's captured where the harness went on this front radiator support. So we know how to put it back together when we get the new engine in. All the harnesses nicely marked. Here's more of the front end cleared off, and now you're getting down to the radiator support and those braces. And we've pulled off the the bumper at this point, and here you can see the body mounts. Been lubricating those body mounts. These rubber donuts will have to come out. Now to get those rubber donuts out, we actually used a pry bar between the frame and the cross member so that we could lift it, flex it a little bit, widen that out so that we could sneak those body mounts out. Needed to get the bolt out, of course, but once you got the bolt out, this section of front support is still sitting on that rubber. We also needed to take these bumper supports, these shock absorbing units off. You can see the bolts are starting to get loosened up there. And here we've gotten the radiator support completely out. Now I'm going to tell you is on one of these cars, and this would apply to the other models I expect too, is this was pretty doggone tough. That support was most likely installed on the body before the fenders went on, and because it ties in here before it was sitting on the frame, right? You put that whole assembly together with the structure. So there was a little bit, I'm going to say, you'll see there are a couple of braces here, especially in the Cadillac engine compartment, that fore and aft, that I don't remember whether my Buick actually had those. But to get the radiator support out, we had to flex those guys, physically almost bend them. We didn't bend them permanently, but we had to flex them a long ways. And we had to back off. There were some braces up above here that we had to do to get those free enough that we could spread those out so we could sneak that radiator support out. That was a kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and we spent quite a bit of time on it because we didn't want to scrape up the fenders. We didn't want to damage any of the parts here in the front. But now, with that out of the way, radiator's out, the air conditioner's out. Once again, we had an air conditioning system that had leaked down quite a long time ago and was empty. So it was opened up, we pulled the whole thing apart, and so the engine is now exposed where we can reach everything that we need to reach. Once again, similar to what we did on the Avalanche, again, you see all the blue tape. Boy, this works really well. Everything we disconnected, we labeled so we knew what it was. Now, when you're pulling this one apart, what you're going to find is some of the wiring goes into the body through the main wiring harness to the dash for the body. Some of it goes into the engine controller. And if you follow here, this big one, this is like the main wiring harness that goes inside the car into the ECM, PCM. Every sensor we disconnected on the engine we labeled so we knew what it was. Now, when you get done, I mean, you kind of have the choice of taking out the ECM and its cabling and selling it. Dan's selling the engine after it comes out. So we're being extra careful. And you got an option of selling it with that wiring harness and ECM or not, depending on who you're selling it to. Some people just want the engine, some might want the whole thing. So we're keeping it all straight. We want to be very careful when we lift this engine out, that when we put chains and things on to hoist it, that we don't damage things. So you'll see in the back here, there's a big EGR solenoid back here, EGR control unit. And that was a little tricky, but we figured out how to remove that and lay it on top of the engine so that we could get our rear chains in without interfering with that. But you need to go through, pull all the hoses, take pieces off so there are places to lift from. And even in this one where I said it's the harness that goes back to the ECM, my memory is there were still a few circuits that went into the car for other things related to perhaps air conditioning and so forth. So again, marking everything very carefully. This one, we pulled off the distributor cap and the spark plug wires, again, to get things out of the way. And this picture kind of highlights, this is, you can see the braid here, this is where engine ground straps come in. And this one went down back and was onto one of the bell housing bolts. But as we go in with the new engine, we're going to want to put in, I'll call it the Chevy small block style grounding. We'll need to use this ground point and then ground to the back of the cylinder heads. Underneath, documenting the transmission shift linkage. This doesn't have a cable. This is an older car that's got the mechanical one on it. And from an initial look, it looks like it may take a little bit of adjustment or modification, but it looks like this mechanism should bolt right up to the 4L60E transmission that will replace the 204R. This dude, yes, the rear transmission mount. Now, this is for the 204R. This one was a little bit tough because we mentioned it, or I mentioned it in the video for the intro, that when we pulled the engine, this one was tough. We could loosen this bolt, that was good, but there wasn't enough clearance. We couldn't get the transmission lifted high enough to get this bolt to clear this bracket on the cross member. The threaded portion was just like a 1/4 inch too long. So what we wanted to do was remove these two bolts here. There's one here and there's one on the opposite side. But this one I think was almost possible, but the one on the back side, you just couldn't. There's no way to get a straight shot on there with a socket. We tried to get on it with an end wrench, and we couldn't get enough leverage, no matter what we did, to break these two bolts loose. They've just been in there a long time. There's a spacer underneath these. And so what we elected to do was we went in with a cutoff, we took this nut off, went in with a cutoff wheel on a Dremel, and cut that bolt off so that we could lift it up just high enough to clear the cross member and get it out. And by then, with everything disconnected, we were able to hook on, get our brackets on, and lift the engine, and scoot it out of the engine compartment and get it cleared out. Now we did take kind of a little bit of a shortcut, which was you can see there's a rag over here. There's a piece of cross member underneath here that will keep the prop shaft from hitting the ground. And you can see the prop shaft slip yoke there. We just lifted the front, we slid the transmission forward. It had already been drained. We slipped it forward, let the drive shaft set down on that rag, and pulled her out. And then Dan went back later and pulled the prop shaft loose at the back end. A couple different ways you could do it. It was the way we chose. This is that bracket. This side is the right-hand side of the car, and that holds exhaust system up, which is why it has this rubber. This is the transmission mount, and there are the two bolts. And you can see here, there's something you want to watch out for is these are shims. There's a pair of them here. And these, what those shims do, the transmission, you want to set the angle of the transmission, and so there are shims to adjust it. When you go back together, you want to make sure that the drive shaft angle is correct, and that the U-joint angles are correct at the rear end and at the transmission. And typically what you want to make sure is that they're parallel within a certain degree. You don't want them like this. You need to have consistent angles across the universal joints, and I'll go into that in the future. But it's really a critical item, or you'll have a lot of vibration in the car. Before we took this apart, I did make some measurements at the front of the engine and on the frame to try to get an estimate of what the prop shaft angles were. And we noted those, wrote those down for future reference. But you'll want to be very careful about that, preserve those shims, because you may need to add or subtract to those when the time comes to put things back together. Now, once the transmission and the engine is out, here are the mounts. Now these are the mounts from the 307 Oldsmobile engine on both sides. These are the clamshells with the rubber in them. We weren't quite sure how the mountings were going to go, and I still have a video coming showing how we trial fit this. That's coming up soon. But I'm trying to sort of keep things in order here. So there are 3 bolts. There are 2 on the top. There are 2 bolt holes on the bottom on the mount, but this mount only uses 3 of them. It's very similar to my Camaro. My Camaro is only using 3 of the 4 bolt holes. But what we found was that those bolt holes are consistent with Chevy mount. Now, here's the 307, all removed and ready to go. You can see here, we pulled off the AC compressor. In part because then we could put a bolt in there and hold the bracket, and then we could come down and pick up a spot on the engine for our lifting chains. So there's a lifting chain point here, there's one here, and then 2 on the back of the cylinder heads to enable us to get that engine out. There's the 204R transmission, and we managed to, took us a little doing, but we managed to get it separated from the engine. And as I'm sitting here recording this, both parts have been sold now. So there's some revenue from taking care of those, found buyers for them, and that's some money to put back into the swap. Here we did a lot of careful measuring to see where on the cross member, how did these mounts fit. When we got all done, here you can see the 3 bolts. When we got all done, there's the bolt holes. There are 3 of them there, and there are 3 of them here. Our intent was that we were going to drill new holes. We assumed that the mounting patterns would likely be different, and we wanted to we thought we'd make new holes. But what we bought was conventional small block Chevy engine mounts that you'd use in a Caprice or in the later model Brougham, where they started using 350 Chevy engines. And those line right up with these bolt holes. They'll drop right in place. And again, going to talk about mounts a little more in a future episode, but they line up, and there's really no good reason to drill extra holes. If we did, my opinion is that if we tried, we'd end up elongating the holes because they wouldn't be far enough different to move. They're not enough different to move over and drill a fresh hole, unless you went sideways. And you could, in theory, you could move them forward. You can see they've got additional holes for other mounts. We're going to go in and use these and use the conventional Chevy. So that's what we did to get things out and get the car get the engine and transmission out, cleared, so that we can start work on the mounting system next for installing the LS and the 4L60E. There's some work required on the rear cross member, and there's some work required on the mounts, and I'll be back soon to show you that. That's all for now.